So just a bit of background. So I've got a background I did a Bachelor of Science and a Masters of Planning, and at university became more and more interested in sustainable agriculture. So I went and did a farm internship in New South Wales in 2012, and when I got back from that, I started Wagtail Urban Farm with Stephen Hoffner, who's in the room tonight, and then I was involved with Wagtail for a couple of years. And then really, as you can see, this is Wagtail down the bottom here, so it's very tiny, sort of backyard scale urban farm. And I wanted to start something bigger that was going to provide a livelihood. So started Village Greens in 2014. So Village Greens started off as a half-acre market garden. We're almost up to an acre now. We've just expanded. And as I said, it's situated within the Aldinga Arts Eco Village, which is about 40 minutes south of Adelaide. So the Eco Village is actually 25 years old. I didn't realise it was this old when I was looking this information up, but it's been a long sort of process of development. The village is 40 acres of land, half of which is devoted to houses and common land around the houses. And then half of it is also a dedicated farm. It's registered as a community corporation, so basically it means that the houses themselves are able to be privately bought and sold on the open market, but then the common land is owned by everyone who owns property within that village. Got a strong focus on permaculture, environmental sustainability and the arts, and there's a lot of kind of, I guess, controls about what kind of houses you can build and all that sort of stuff within the village. They also collectively manage all of their common land services, things like street lighting, waste, all of that sort of stuff. So the council doesn't sort of manage any of that. And this is just a visual overview. So you can see the housing part of the eco village there, and then the farmland on this side. When we started in 2014, so you can see this is the half-acre market garden here, and we've just expanded over this side as well. And when we started, there wasn't much else happening. There was about an acre fruit orchard, wastewater treatment plant with a few holding dams and things, but not really a lot happening sort of in terms of commercial agriculture on the farmland. So just going into a bit of detail about our business. So there's 2 full-time directors, so Lucy and myself. We started off with 4 and now there's only 2 of us. We have a couple of employees, one of which is Phoebe in the room as well. And we're a formal company structure, and I'll go into a bit of detail about why we chose that kind of a business structure. We also have a 5-year lease with the Eco Village, and I'll talk a bit about that as well. So why a company? We wanted to be a for-profit organisation, I guess, to try and demonstrate that it's possible to make a living farming. I'd been involved with a number of not-for-profits doing more social benefit stuff, but was interested in kind of doing it, in a more financial way. Also, a company has a shareholder structure, so it allows us to basically change the number of shares, which has been quite flexible. As I said before, we started off with 4 people, 4 shareholders. 2 of them have dropped out for different reasons, but we've managed to transition those shares over to us fairly seamlessly, whereas in a partnership arrangement, it's a lot harder to kind of have that transition. Companies also allow you to pay directors' fees, even though we calculate how much we pay ourselves based on our hourly, hours worked. We technically, they're just directors' fees, and so then we can get around the fact that we're not actually paying ourselves anywhere near minimum wage at the moment. So that's kind of that was important for me as well, that we were kind of that was able to be flexible when we're starting up. Any startup business, you're working a lot and you're not paying yourself very much at all, and so that kind of fit in with us. I've just got to point here that not-for-profits are really amazing. They're a lot cheaper, a lot easier to set up for groups that want to primarily achieve social benefit. And we did look into co-op structures. At the time, we were kind of advised by some lawyers not to do a co-op. The main reason that I understand is that co-ops traditionally are basically a cooperative of existing businesses that come together to achieve some mutual benefit. So it might be marketing, it might be sharing equipment and that kind of thing. Whereas we were just individuals coming together to start something, so it didn't really make sense for us to form a co-op. We were also advised that no accountant would really understand how to manage co-ops. So yeah, that was just one of the other reasons that factored into how we structured it. So why do we lease land? So leasing land is a great way to start if you have limited capital, or it's the only way to start. So for veggies and animals as well, it really means you can get started, building this business, building this enterprise that's not tied down to a specific patch of land. So you can move the land, move the enterprise if and when you need to. Obviously, there's a lot less financial pressure in startup. You're not paying for a mortgage on top of trying to build up, building your skills. So for the first day I'm talking about, skills development. That's happening when you're running a business as a startup. You're trying to build up your soil as well, soil fertility. You're also trying to build your markets, and those three things together is just a huge burden. That having a mortgage on top of that would just be a killer. And I also think the startup money. So we managed to crowdfund $17,000 when we started, and we put that straight into a greenhouse. We put it into a walk-behind tractor with a tiller, also irrigation. So we put that money into investments that would return money in the future. And I think that's the better way to go if you have limited capital, that you're putting that money into income-generating investments rather than just paying for a mortgage. And why do we choose Eco Village? So there was a number of assumptions. The point down the bottom, 3 out of the 4, the original instigators were from the Eco Village. So we were already kind of thinking that this was going to be a good place to farm. But myself, I don't own any land in the village. So, but some of my assumptions when I was looking for land, and I was looking for quite a while, was that there was underutilised land within the Eco Village. That whole farmland had not much happening on it. An assumption that we could probably negotiate some cheap rent. That we had access to tools, so that the village had a tractor we used for site preparation. They also had a lot of infrastructure, so they had a big shed with PV system on it, connected to mains power that we could just tap straight into for running a cool room and for washing all our vegetables and things. At the time, we were looking at using the recycled water from the village. So the village treats all of its own sewage in a wastewater treatment plant on site. We were looking at potentially tertiary treating that to a standard that we could grow vegetables. Turned out to be way too expensive for our scale. But that was one of the things we were considering at the time. It's also close to supportive consumers. So we were thinking we had a captive market there. And that didn't really turn out to be true, but I'll touch on that a little bit in a second. And it also really fitted in with the plan. So the village as a whole had this plan to feed the village by 2020, and there wasn't really anything happening, at that time. So just a bit about the specifics for leasing the land. So one of the big things was that we actually required unanimous approval from the village to begin farming on common land. So basically it was the village had to decide as a whole whether it was okay for a private company to make money off commonly owned land, which is obviously a fairly big decision, and probably not something that people, when they first bought into the village had really considered. So this took a lot of time to negotiate, and to get everyone across the line, because we required it unanimous. So one person could have derailed the whole project, but we managed to achieve that, which was great. And just there's a number of different lease terms that we sort of agreed to. So there's a license, and I'll talk about each one of these. But there's a farm license, there's an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding. We've got temporary structure guidelines and also some farm sustainability guidelines. So it's quite a bureaucratic and kind of lease agreement, but it's one of the sort of costs that was that we had to factor in. So just a bit about the different license. So we actually have a farm license. It's not a lease, and this is because there was actually a lawyer who lived in the village who suggested that if we were leasing the land for over a certain amount of time, and because it was common property, that we might actually have squatters' rights to the land after a certain amount of time. I didn't know anything about squatters' rights, but in order to please this, this particular lawyer, it's called a license rather than a lease. And from my understanding, it basically just means that we have less control over, what we actually do on that land. But basically, it sets out the boundaries in very specific detail, dots on a map. The fee schedules, so of what we're paying for rent, water, electricity, also the term, so it's a 5-year lease, insurance requirements, all those sort of basics. And then the MOU outlines these expectations from both parties, so what we kind of expect of the village and what they expect of us. And so this is sort of managing things like use of village property like tractors and their shed. Also for me, managing that community interaction, so that we were quite clear that members of the community couldn't just come in and help themselves to produce, for example, that we were growing this as a business. We'd be selling the vegetables to the community. So the MOU sort of specifies all of that. Temporary structure guidelines basically regulates what we can build on our leased or licensed land. So everything from footings, the types of materials we can use. The idea being that that everything is fairly temporary, that we can move it fairly easily if and when we need to, which kind of suits us as well. Like we don't want to be putting, a lot of money into fixed structures to then have to sort of walk away from them if we move on for whatever reason. And then finally, the farm sustainability guidelines. We have to adhere to organic standards of crop production, so NASA or ACO. Also the permaculture principles, thinking about things like neighbours and that sort of stuff as well. So that's all set out within those guidelines. So as you can see, it's quite a lot of things. And then on top of this is council planning approval and all those sort of other regulations that everyone sort of has to adhere to. So some of the lessons learned. Company structure has worked for us. As I said, we've already needed to transition how the share arrangement worked, so it's allowed us a lot of flexibility. If we went in, we didn't really know each other that well going into it, and I think if we'd gone in as a partnership into this kind of operation, that we would have had to destroy that original partnership agreement and kind of craft a new one, whereas this company structure has allowed us to kind of evolve fairly quickly over time. It's well understood by accountants as well, which helps. And this goes to something that the first Sam was talking about in terms of sort of building skills. For me, running Wagtail and probably also doing the farm internship was really essential in terms of a precursor to farming at the Eco Village, because I had developed a good reputation. I'd developed basically crafting a good pitch for the village. So I had a lot of photos from Wagtail. I could have I put together financial estimates, all these kind of things based on my experience at Wagtail and the internship, so that when we went to the village to do the pitch, it looked like we were legitimate, that we knew what we were doing, and people had confidence in us. So that was definitely, that's a key, and it's difficult. It's a bit like getting when you're renting, you want people want you to have rental history to rent a property, but how do you get rental history if you're only entering for the first time kind of thing? So it's a bit of a catch-22, but if you can get some experience, whether it's an internship or any kind of way that you can get your hands dirty to begin with before you take on something big, is a good idea. And just finally, just some of the lessons learned. So some of the benefits: the community was close by to buy the food. Although the big thing for us here is that, and this is something I realised too late, is that, when you think about a farming enterprise, you think that, well, personally I was like, well, we're going to grow these amazing organic vegetables, everyone's going to want to eat them. But the reality is that everyone is already eating somewhere else. Everyone is getting their food from the places that they like to get that, whether it's Woolworths, Coles, farmers markets, whatever. So you're really changing behaviour, you're changing habits, and that takes a long time to change. So there was a core group of people from the Eco Village that were committed to buying from us from day one, which is amazing. But it really has taken us 3 years to get to the point where, it's making up about a third of our revenue. So it's still nowhere near our main sort of income. And that's just sort of a caveat as for people, young farmers looking at opportunities for farming, that the market research is a huge part of your business proposal. And we did a lot of surveys. We did, how many times a week do you buy carrots? Whatever, blah, blah, blah. We did very detailed whatever, but when it comes down to it, what people do with their time is it's based on habit. Some of the other benefits are obviously access to tractors, the shed, tools, all of these things. Like if we had to set up irrigation infrastructure, power out to the site, all of those things, it would have been sort of $50,000 to $100,000 to get started. So and I've been to a lot of other small scale market gardens in Australia who don't have access to power, or they've had to put in water or whatever, and those things are just killer costs. So again, when you're negotiating these kind of leases, make sure that you've got the infrastructure up front. One of the other benefits, we're very generous. That we have a very generous lease term, so it's about 1% of our gross income at the moment. It's it's basically this line here, so it's fixed fairly low, which is good, because basically the village wanted to see the farm being used and it wasn't being used. So, and I think the other benefit for farming in this kind of situation is that the land is commonly owned. So for me, it removes that risk that the land might be sold at a future date. So basically, it's forming a contract with 140 odd households that you're farming on that common land. So for me, that's kind of a big thing in terms of land security, knowing that we've got a place here in the future. Some of the drawbacks, obviously. Some of the levels of restrictions and regulations controlling what we do. And this isn't specific to the Eco Village, but this is just some of the challenges of farming sort of on the boundary. The sort of peri-urban areas. We've had neighbours complaining of smells of compost. We buy all our compost in. We don't make anything on site, but even so, you still get complaints every now and again. And yeah, finally, just this slow decision making. So really needing to factor in like a good 6 months to a year before, changing anything or proposing anything new. So that is it for me. So any questions?